Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into a holiday you think you already know. A table of warm dishes, familiar stories, and polite gratitude. But beneath it all, a much older current runs quietly. Not the parades, not the cartoons, not the version wrapped in construction paper feathers, but the long, winding, and sometimes uncomfortable history of how Thanksgiving really came to be. We'll wander through harvest rituals older than America, starving settlers studying unfamiliar soil, Wampanoag generosity that kept strangers alive, and the centuries when the holiday simply vanished. You'll hear about myths polished into tradition, presidents shaping a national mood, and how a single November meal became an anchor of memory, comfort, and contradiction. If this kind of soft, unhurried storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who else is drifting into sleep beside the same quiet history. So settle in. Let the room dim itself. Let the scent of autumn, real or imagined, curl around the edges of your mind. And let's begin long before any pilgrim touched American soil, at the ancient, half-remembered roots of gratitude itself. Long before any November table was set, before the word Thanksgiving existed, before borders or colonies or calendars drew their lines across the land, people already understood that survival depended on paying attention to the seasons. Harvest was the moment when the earth finally loosened its quiet grip and allowed humans a breath of relief. The crops stood in neat rows or tangled patches: barley, corn, wheat, squash, and for a brief time the world felt generous. Gratitude wasn't a ritual yet. It was a reflex, an exhale. After months of watching the sky, fearing frost, and hoping for rain, it made sense that the moment food gathered in the hands felt almost sacred. Across ancient North America, gratitude lived in the rhythm of the land itself. The people who lived there long before Europeans arrived did not wait for a single feast or a single date to mark the harvest. Instead, they honored each crop as it ripened, each plant as it made its offering. For many Eastern Woodlands nations, the most significant of these was the green corn ceremony, a slow, deliberate ritual held not in autumn, but in late summer when the first ears of corn ripened. Corn wasn't simply food. It was life, ancestry, and identity woven together. The ceremony began with restraint rather than indulgence. No one touched the new corn until prayers had been offered, fires renewed, and harmony restored among the people. Gratitude required patience, humility, and a willingness to remember that the earth is only what it chooses to give. These ceremonies often lasted several days. Homes were cleaned, old grudges laid down, broken relationships mended. Dancers moved to the sound of rattles. Elders spoke blessings over the fields. Only after the rituals were complete was the new corn eaten, roasted, boiled, or ground into meals that tasted of sunlight and soil. Gratitude was not a single moment, but a cycle, a way of being in step with the land's own quiet generosity. The harvest was not just about filling storage pits. It was about reaffirming balance between the people, the land, and the unseen forces that sustained them. Farther west, among the tribes of the plains and southwest, different harvest rituals developed, but with the same undercurrent. Survival was not guaranteed. The Pueblo peoples, for example, built entire ceremonies around honoring the spirits that governed rain and growth. Their dances, performed in plazas surrounded by adobe walls, were prayers in motion, steps meant to call down clouds, to coax the earth into yielding beans, corn, and squash. Gratitude here was two-directional, thanking the spirits for what had come and inviting generosity again in the future. In harsh climates, gratitude was inseparable from hope. In the far north, the Inuit marked their own version of harvest, though theirs depended less on crops and more on the seasonal migrations of animals. When the first whales or seals returned, when caribou moved across the tundra in great waves. Families marked the moment with songs, gifts, and shared meals. Their gratitude was not for plants, but for the complex agreement between human skill, animal cycles, and the brutal generosity of Arctic weather. Every successful hunt reminded them that the world, even a cold one, still had room for mercy. Across the ocean, in Europe, gratitude festivals grew from other fears. Winters there could be long and bitter, and harvest failure meant hunger that could stretch for months. So people created festivals that blurred work with worship. In ancient Greece, the festival of Thesmophoria honored Demeter, goddess of grain, through rituals that mixed fertility, grief, and celebration. Women gathered on hillsides, offering cakes and wheat, retelling stories of the goddess and her daughter Persephone. Gratitude, in their world, required acknowledging both abundance and loss, because every harvest was a negotiation with forces beyond human control. The Romans had their own harvest observances, including the festival of Cerealia, dedicated to Ceres, their version of Demeter. Offerings of grain, wine, and honey were brought to temples, and communities feasted to mark the gathering of crops. Yet even their celebrations carried a tension, the sense that nature was both generous and unpredictable. Gratitude wasn't just a celebration. It was a plea for stability, a recognition of how fragile life could be. In Northern Europe, where days could grow short and storms fierce, harvest rituals leaned heavily into superstition. People believed that the final sheaf of grain held the spirit of the field. Cutting it was done with ceremony, or even with playful competitions. Whoever cut the last sheaf was responsible for housing the corn spirit through winter. Whether treated with respect or mischief, the custom revealed an old truth. People needed to believe the earth itself was alive, listening, capable of blessing or cursing. Gratitude, in their view, was insurance for the next season. These rituals, scattered across continents and centuries, shared a common shape. They helped people pause. They marked the moment when labor gave way to relief. Even in the harshest societies, people understood that acknowledging abundance was as essential as storing it. Gratitude was a way of promising themselves that fear would not swallow them whole. But why did humans everywhere create these moments? Partly because survival was delicate. Before supermarkets and storage technologies, life depended on a few weeks of good weather, the absence of pests, and the right amount of rain. If any of these failed, hunger followed. Gratitude rituals emerged not because people were sentimental, but because they were honest. They knew how little control they had. A ceremony created a sense of order in a world that often felt chaotic. Another reason was community. Harvest rituals brought people together during the one moment of the year when there was enough to share. For days or weeks, villages feasted, told stories, and reconnected after months of toil. Gratitude became a social glue, a way to remind everyone that they depended on each other as much as on the earth. The act of sharing food forged trust and eased old tensions. To eat together was to briefly blur the borders between families, clans, and even whole nations. A third reason was memory. Each festival carried the weight of generations, linking the living to the dead. Elders taught younger members how to prepare feasts, how to honor the spirits, how to recognize the right moment to harvest. Gratitude rituals preserved knowledge at a time when knowledge meant survival. Every feast was a living archive, a reminder of what ancestors had endured. All of this mattered long before any Europeans imagined a feast in North America. Ancient harvest rituals on both sides of the Atlantic had already established the emotional blueprint that Thanksgiving would later follow. Relief, remembrance, community, and humility. The feast itself, the moment when food becomes more than nourishment, was a universal language. When Europeans eventually began their voyages westward, they carried their harvest customs with them. Prayers of thanks, communal meals, and rituals meant to bind communities. But what they found in North America wasn't just new land. It was a continent already rich with its own traditions of gratitude. From the Iroquois ceremonies of seasonal Thanksgiving to the southwestern offerings at the end of harvest, the land was layered with meaning long before colonists set foot upon it. In this sense, the story of Thanksgiving doesn't begin in 1621. It begins in the world's earliest fields, around fires where ancestors celebrated the earth's gifts. It begins with hands holding the first ripe fruit of the season, with breath rising into the air on a cool morning, with hearts relieved that another cycle of hunger and hope had turned one more time. The holiday we know, trimmed into neat stories, wrapped with familiar symbols, is just the newest version of something ancient. Gratitude has been humanity's companion since the first seeds sprouted in the first soil. Whether whispered to spirits, sung in dances, written in prayers, or felt in silence, gratitude was always a way of saying, "We survived. We have enough. The earth has not forgotten us." And though the rituals changed across time, candles replaced by electric light, feasts shifted from harvest season to late November, the heart of it all stayed the same. We still need a moment to acknowledge what we have. We still crave the brief peace that comes from sharing food. We still gather around tables to remind ourselves that abundance, however small, is worth honoring. So before any pilgrim raised a cup in Plymouth, before turkeys and parades became symbols of the day, there was simply this: human beings looking at the fields around them, breathing out, and realizing they had made it through another year. That realization, quiet, universal, and older than every nation, is where the story of Thanksgiving truly begins. By the time the little ship sighted the coastline, the pilgrims were more bone than hope. The crossing had taken longer than expected, 66 days of storms that tossed their world like driftwood. The Mayflower was never meant for passengers. It was a cargo ship repurposed for souls who wanted a different life, though many wondered, somewhere between the creaking timbers and the endless gray horizon, whether the new world they imagined would ever greet them at all. When land finally appeared through the autumn fog, relief didn't come as joy. It arrived as something smaller, quieter, the simple knowledge that they could stop moving. The shoreline was unfamiliar, harsh and wild. They had intended to settle farther south, near the mouth of the Hudson River, but bad weather and shifting shoals made that impossible. So they anchored where they could, a place of cold wind, bare trees, and stony ground that would later be called Plymouth. It looked nothing like the fertile fields and soft meadows described in explorers' journals. Instead, it seemed to crouch against winter like an animal waiting to endure it. But they had no choice. They were too tired to search for anything better. Their first steps on land were cautious, almost reverent. The forests towered above them, silent and immense. The air smelled of pine and salt. For a moment, they must have imagined that this new world would welcome them gently. But winter arrived quickly, like a hand closing around the settlement before it had even begun. They had no houses, no crops, and only the provisions they had carried across the sea: salted meat, dried peas, stale biscuits as hard as stone. The cold seeped into their clothes, their bones, their breath. Even the fires they built seemed too small to push it back. Sickness came next, creeping through the cramped shelters they threw together. Pneumonia, scurvy, fevers that left people unable to stand. Many of the pilgrims had spent the voyage huddled below deck, breathing the same air day after day. Now, in the thin shelter of makeshift huts, the illnesses bloomed. It was not uncommon for several people to die in a single day. They wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them to shallow graves, and buried them quickly, praying that their neighbors across the ocean and the unfamiliar people of this new land would not see how fragile they were. Their journal entries from that winter read like whispers rather than records. Food was so scarce that the settlers rationed every crumb. Sometimes meals were nothing more than a spoonful of cornmeal boiled into thin mush. Other times, nothing at all. The ocean, which offered little during the stormy months, mocked them with its icy waves. Some settlers walked the shore in desperate hope that a fish might wash up, or that a piece of driftwood could serve as fuel for one more hour of warmth. Even as hunger hollowed them out, they continued to build. The work was slow. The wind was relentless. Tools cracked in the cold, and hands went numb around the handles. But they needed shelter, walls, anything that would allow them to survive another night. The meeting house went up first, a low structure of rough-hewn logs. Then the houses, each one small and crude, built with more urgency than skill. Smoke from green wood curled above the rooftops, thin and struggling, like the settlers themselves. For every house completed, another grave was dug. Over half of the pilgrims died that winter, men, women, and children. Some mornings, only a few were strong enough to prepare the bodies. The settlement became a quiet field of grief. They buried their dead at night to hide their weakening numbers from any watching eyes. They removed the crosses from the graves to avoid drawing attention. Vulnerability was too dangerous to show. The only defense they had was the illusion of strength. And yet, small moments of resilience glimmered through the dark months. A woman who had lost her husband still managed to care for children who weren't her own. A man recovering from fever went out to mend a neighbor's roof. A group of settlers gathered what little they had and shared it, knowing that a few bites of food were useless unless they kept everyone alive. They were strangers thrown together by faith and desperation, but hardship made them a kind of family. They held each other up because there was no one else to do it. When the first hints of spring appeared, the thawing earth, the return of birds, the sound of dripping snow, the pilgrims must have felt something close to disbelief. They had lived through the winter, though many had not. The survivors emerged from their shelters like people waking from a long, cold dream. The land around them seemed less threatening now, not because it had softened, but because they had endured its hardest face. They began to explore more confidently, gathering timber, clearing fields, taking note of plants that the snow had hidden. It was during these early spring days that the pilgrims made contact with someone who would change everything. A man walked into their settlement, speaking in English, halting but understandable. His presence must have felt like impossibility made real. A man was Samoset, a sagamore from the Wabanaki Confederacy, and his greeting cracked the isolation that had defined their winter. Through him, the pilgrims learned the first pieces of what they needed: where to plant, how to fish the nearby waters, which places were inhabited and which were dangerous. But he returned a few days later with someone even more extraordinary, Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto. Squanto spoke English fluently, having survived kidnapping, slavery, and years abroad. His life was marked by tragedy, but his knowledge became the settlers' lifeline. He showed them how to plant corn properly, how to use fish as fertilizer, how to gather eels from the muddy inlets, how to understand the land they had entered. He was a bridge, a human thread between two worlds that barely understood each other. His guidance didn't erase the suffering of the winter, but it gently nudged the settlement toward stability. Meanwhile, another presence shaped the pilgrims' fragile beginnings, the Wampanoag leader Massasoit. He approached not with welcome, but with caution, for his people had their own wounds and fears. Disease had swept through their villages years earlier, and European ships had been sources of both trade and danger. Still, Massasoit saw an opportunity. An alliance could strengthen his position against rival groups, especially the Narragansett, who had not been devastated by plague. So he chose diplomacy. A treaty was made: mutual protection, mutual respect, a promise of peace. The agreement was fragile, but it held, in part because the pilgrims were too weak to challenge it, and in part because the Wampanoag were wise enough to see benefit in patience. As the months warmed, the settlement transformed from a scattering of huts into something resembling a village. Fields were planted, houses repaired. The graveyard, though still fresh in memory, stopped growing. The pilgrims began to believe that perhaps this new world would allow them a future. Their survival was no longer a question of hours, but of seasons. They had endured the darkest part of the story, though they didn't yet know what traditions, myths, and misunderstandings would later grow from their simple struggle to stay alive. And as the summer ripened, when the corn rose high and the rivers filled with fish again, the Pilgrims found themselves approaching a new moment, one that would bring Wampanoag and English families together in a gathering neither side could have predicted, and which future generations would reshape into a tale far removed from the quiet, complicated truth that waited in the warm air of early autumn. Before the Pilgrims ever saw the New England coastline, before their small ship appeared as a speck on the horizon, the Wampanoag people had been tending this land for thousands of years. The rivers, the forests, the shallow marshes that stretched like green mirrors. All of these places formed a world that was not just inhabited, but deeply understood. Every season carried its own responsibilities, and every responsibility had its rhythm. While the newcomers were stumbling through unfamiliar woods, the Wampanoag already knew where the soil loosened easily under the frost, where the corn grew tallest, and where the fish congregated in spring like silver threads gathering in quiet pools. To the Wampanoag, the land was not something to be claimed or conquered. It was something to enter into agreement with. Fields did not exist in the European sense, rectangles fenced and owned. Instead, gardens were woven into the natural world. Clearing was done with respect. Trees were not cut unless necessary. Soil was renewed, not stripped. The idea that someone could own land the way one might own a garment or a tool would have seemed strange. What mattered was caretaking, reciprocity, and the understanding that the earth provided only if humans held up their part of the relationship. Their year was a circle, not a ladder. In winter, families moved inland, seeking shelter among the trees, where the wind could not reach them so easily. They hunted deer and trapped small animals, warming themselves with fires made from carefully gathered wood. In spring, as the ice retreated, they moved toward the coast. The rivers filled with herring, and nets woven through generations were shaken out and stretched toward the water. Summer was for planting and tending gardens, corn rising in rows, beans climbing their tall stalks like green bracelets, squash spreading wide at the base to keep the soil cool. These three sisters, grown together, supported one another, each one improving the ground for the others. It was a small masterpiece of agriculture, perfected through long patience and observation. So when the Pilgrims arrived, half-starved, sick, and bewildered, the Wampanoag already knew exactly what these strangers did not: how to coax food from sandy, stubborn earth, how to find wild edible plants when gardens had yet to sprout, how to read the tides and currents of the coastline, how to survive. But they also knew something far more complicated: the danger of contact. Years before the Mayflower, European ships had come to this same shoreline. Some crews traded, others kidnapped. And with those ships came diseases that the Wampanoag had no resistance to. Entire villages were emptied. Fields grew wild. Bones rested in quiet clearings where families had lived only a season before. When the Pilgrims landed, the place they chose for their settlement had once been the Wampanoag village of Patuxet, abandoned after plague swept through it. This history hung in the air long before any formal meeting. To the Wampanoag, the new arrivals were not just strangers. They were living reminders of something that had already taken so much. Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, carried that awareness into every decision. He led a people whose numbers had dwindled, whose rivals, particularly the Narragansett to the southwest, remained strong and unweakened by disease. Alliance was not an act of generosity. It was a strategic calculation. Help could be offered, yes, but only if it served the long-term protection of his people. Yet diplomacy is never only strategy. It is also instinct, intuition, and the careful reading of character. And this is where individuals change the shape of the moment. Samoset was the first to walk calmly into the pilgrim settlement and greet them in English. His appearance must have felt surreal to men who had been preparing themselves for danger. But for the Wampanoag, this was a test, a way to learn who the newcomers were, how they behaved, and what they wanted. Samoset spoke with them, watched them, and then returned with someone who could judge more deeply. Tisquantum, or Squanto, had lived through the full cycle of European contact. Years before, traders had kidnapped him, taken him across the ocean, and sold him into slavery. He escaped to England, learned the language, and eventually found his way home, only to discover that his entire village had died in the epidemic. He was a survivor in the most literal sense, navigating two worlds that rarely understood one another. When he met the pilgrims, he recognized in them a kind of desperation he understood painfully well. Under Massasoit's authority, Squanto became an intermediary. He taught the pilgrims how to plant corn the Wampanoag way, with fish buried near the seed to feed the soil. He showed them where to gather edible greens in early spring when the gardens were still bare. He explained how to find eels in the muddy banks of the river, pulling them from the earth with a confidence that must have looked like magic to men who could barely stand after winter. He walked the forests with them, naming plants, pointing out traps, explaining the patterns of animals. He guided them not because he forgot what had happened to his people, but because his life had taught him that survival often depends on alliances, however tentative. And Massasoit watched all of this with steady patience. His decision to form a treaty with the Pilgrims was remarkable, not because it was generous, but because it was deliberate. He offered peace, not friendship, but coexistence. In return, he expected protection against rivals and a stable understanding between two communities that were, for the moment, equally uncertain of one another. The treaty held, in part because the Pilgrims were in no condition to break it. Their numbers were too small, their tools too few, their muscles still weakened by winter. But it also held because the Wampanoag enforced it with quiet authority. They visited the settlement regularly. They observed. They corrected misunderstandings before they grew teeth. They made sure that what had been agreed upon remained intact. For the Pilgrims, every day of spring and summer felt like a gradual stepping back from the edge of collapse. Gardens sprouted, fishing improved, sick bodies regained their strength. The settlement began to resemble something stable, but beneath that new growth was the undeniable truth. None of it would have been possible without the Wampanoag. And still, the future was not a simple path. The Pilgrims did not fully understand the political landscape they had walked into. They didn't grasp the delicate balance of relations between tribes, or the spiritual significance of certain lands, or the long traditions of stewardship that shaped every decision. To them, survival looked like a blessing. To the Wampanoag, it was part of a negotiation still unfolding, one that required constant attention. As the air grew warmer and the crops reached upward, the two communities found themselves walking a narrow path between cooperation and caution. Their worlds had collided not in friendship, but in necessity. But necessity, in its quiet way, can bind people together long enough for something unexpected to take root. And by the time autumn approached, when the corn dried on its stalks and the air carried the smell of wood smoke, that fragile cooperation would lead to a gathering that history would later reshape into something cleaner, simpler, and far less honest than the real moment that was approaching. By the time the first harvest of 1621 arrived, the Pilgrims were still learning what it meant to live on land that was not entirely theirs and never entirely familiar. The corn that rose in their fields had been planted using Wampanoag instruction. The fish that smoked over their fires had been caught with Wampanoag methods. And the sudden abundance, the feeling that, for the first time in a year, hunger might loosen its grip, filled the settlement with a kind of cautious relief. But relief is not the same as celebration, and certainly not the kind later paintings would imagine. There were no tables spread with silver dishes, no roasted turkeys carved ceremonially, no pies cooling in window frames. What sat on the pilgrims' minds was simpler. We survived. And for now, that was enough to justify a small day of recreation. Not a holiday, but a pause. Governor Bradford called for a modest feast, the sort of gathering that would have been unremarkable in England. A meal after a successful harvest, some target shooting for sport, and perhaps a moment of shared Thanksgiving. The word Thanksgiving itself did not mean a meal. In their world, it meant a solemn day-long religious fast. What they planned was something entirely different, closer to a harvest festival, something practical and a little informal. They were not staging an event to echo through centuries. They were simply tired people trying to acknowledge a difficult year. What they didn't expect was company. Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, had not been invited in the way modern invitations work. No one delivered a message or extended an official welcome. But within Wampanoag territory, movement was constant, and news traveled by observation as much as by speech. The sound of gunfire, the pilgrims practicing their marksmanship, carried through the woods, sharp and sudden. To the Wampanoag, who maintained a careful treaty of mutual protection, such noise was not something to ignore. Massasoit arrived not with a handful of men, but with around 90 warriors. The sudden appearance of so many guests must have caused the pilgrims to tense, even if they hid it politely. Their own numbers were still small. Their muskets took time to load. Their fort was unfinished. And yet the treaty they had formed earlier in the year held enough weight for both sides to choose calm over fear. What happened next was not the carefully choreographed, peaceful banquet imagined centuries later. It was an improvised negotiation of space and needs. The pilgrims did not have nearly enough food prepared for such a crowd. Their harvest had been decent, but not abundant enough to feed a group that large without help. And without being asked, the Wampanoag supplied what the occasion demanded. They went into the forest and brought back 5 deer. A contribution so substantial it would have changed the nature of the meal entirely. In that moment, the power dynamic inverted and then balanced again. The Wampanoag were the providers. The pilgrims, still newcomers, were the ones receiving. And yet both sides needed the alliance too much to let that imbalance cause offense. What emerged was not a feast of equals, nor an act of charity, but a careful dance of coexistence. For 3 days, the two groups mingled in ways that were likely awkward, curious, and wordless in places. The Wampanoag observed how the pilgrims handled food, fire, and tools. The pilgrims watched how the Wampanoag moved through the woods and worked together. There would have been language barriers, gestures repeated until understood, and long silences that made space for these differences to settle. Food was simple and shaped by the land. Venison roasted over flame, fish pulled from the nearby waters, corn pounded into coarse bread, and perhaps nuts or berries gathered from the surrounding marshes and woods. The flavors that modern readers associate with Thanksgiving, sweet cranberry sauces, spiced pumpkin pies, buttery potatoes, were absent. Instead, the table was the land itself, offering what was already there: earthiness, salt, smoke, and the faint sweetness of late autumn corn. The pilgrims demonstrated their muskets, firing them in practice sessions that were as much display as recreation. The Wampanoag participated in games and contests of skill, some their own, some new to them. These shared activities were not signs of friendship in the modern sense, but gestures of trust, ways to reassure one another that the fragile peace would hold. Still, beneath these moments ran a quiet undercurrent of caution. The pilgrims knew they were guests in a land that had sustained an entire people for generations. The Wampanoag knew they were dealing with foreigners who carried unpredictable customs and powerful weapons. Each side watched the other closely, reading gestures, testing politeness, confirming intentions. Massasoit, steady and composed, remained the anchor of his people's presence. The Pilgrims treated him with the careful respect due to a leader whose cooperation kept them safe from neighboring threats. His warriors stayed near him, not hostile but alert. And the Pilgrims, who had spent the last year on the edge of survival, sensed clearly that the continued goodwill of the Wampanoag was not guaranteed. It had to be maintained. What the 3 days truly represented was not a holiday or a moment of mutual joy. It was a rare pause in a relationship defined by vulnerability on both sides. The Pilgrims depended on the Wampanoag for knowledge and protection. The Wampanoag, weakened by disease and pressured by rival tribes, saw advantage in supporting a small but potentially useful new ally. Cooperation was not a sentimental choice. It was strategic, necessary, and steeped in realism. And yet, within that necessity, something human took root. Moments of shared firelight, laughter from games, the simple act of eating together. These moments did not erase tension or rewrite the future, but they offered a brief space where two worlds, so different in belief and experience, could exist side by side without fear. For the Pilgrims, the gathering probably felt like a promise that hardship might ease, that their settlement might last, that peace was possible. For the Wampanoag, it was likely something more practical, a way to confirm that these strangers, for now, would honor their agreement. There were no speeches, no declarations, no grand symbols of unity. Just 3 days of coexistence built on caution, curiosity, and shared necessity. And when those days ended, both groups returned to their own lives, carrying with them impressions and questions that would shape the months to come. The harvest was over. Winter approached again, and beneath the quiet surface of cooperation, the earliest signs of misunderstanding, ambition, and cultural collision were beginning to stir, subtle at first, but unmistakable. The peaceful gathering of 1621 would become a story retold and reshaped for generations. But at the time, it was simply this: two peoples sharing the same land, trying to survive a future neither could predict. And as autumn deepened into chill and the nights grew longer, that uncertain future would begin to take clearer shape in the seasons that followed. For all the weight and symbolism later attached to that 3-day gathering in 1621, the people who lived through it did not treat it as the beginning of anything. They did not mark the date in their diaries. They did not speak of it in sermons. They did not celebrate its anniversary. To them, it was a brief moment of survival, a harvest festival among many, a small pause before the next winter arrived. And after it ended, life simply moved forward. In fact, if you had walked through the Plymouth settlement in the years that followed and asked anyone about the first Thanksgiving, you would have been met with confusion. The term meant nothing. No one used it to describe a meal. The only Thanksgivings the Pilgrims recognized were solemn religious observances, days of fasting and repentance, not feasts. A day of plenty would have been the opposite of what they considered holy. The 1621 harvest gathering was so unremarkable to them that it received only a passing mention in a single letter written by Edward Winslow. One paragraph, one small description, and then, for centuries, silence. Part of that silence came from the sheer difficulty of life. The colony struggled with drought, crop failures, political tensions, and the delicate alliances they held with neighboring tribes. There was no space, no energy, and no cultural inclination to preserve memories of a single communal meal. For the next generation of settlers, the focus shifted entirely to survival, to expansion, and to the increasingly complicated entanglements with indigenous nations. Few had the time or the desire to romanticize their early hardships. Historical moments often become important only when later generations need them to be. And in the 17th century, no one needed this feast. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay did not celebrate it. Other colonies did not adopt it. The event did not spread, did not linger in collective memory, and did not inspire a tradition. It remained buried in the forgotten corners of a young society that had more pressing concerns. Even the Wampanoag did not mark it as a singular moment. Their interactions with the Pilgrims continued, but the balance of power grew uneasy. Competition over land and resources intensified. The fragile peace Massasoit had negotiated began to strain. In Wampanoag memory, the early years of coexistence became overshadowed by what followed: disease, pressure, and increasing English expansion. The 1621 harvest was not a symbol of harmony. It was a brief pause before tension darkened the horizon. By the 18th century, when the original Plymouth settlers were long gone, the event had vanished almost completely from public consciousness. A few historians, sifting through boxes of letters and diaries, might have stumbled across Winslow's description, but it held no more significance to them than any other colonial detail, a footnote in a story much larger and more troubled. Even during the American Revolution, when the colonies were searching for symbols of unity, the 1621 feast did not resurface. Revolutionary leaders declared days of thanksgiving, but these were tied to military victories, political triumphs, and moments of national relief. They had nothing to do with pilgrims, Wampanoag, or an old harvest meal. The past was useful only when it offered stories of resilience, not ambiguity. The quietest centuries of a holiday are often the most telling. Thanksgiving, before it became Thanksgiving, lived only as a small, unnoticed memory. No parades, no turkeys, no family gatherings. Just a fading mention tucked away in a single colonial document. It rested there, without fanfare, waiting for a world that needed it. That world finally arrived in the 19th century. By the early 1800s, America had grown into a young, restless nation searching for traditions that felt old, even if they weren't. The country lacked deep ancestral rituals in the European sense. It lacked ancient festivals, ancient kings, ancient stories. Much of its early history was fractured by regional identity and conflict. And so writers, ministers, and politicians began looking backward not for accuracy, but for myth-making. It was at this moment that a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hall, the same woman who wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, discovered Winslow's forgotten account. She was captivated not by the reality of the 1621 gathering, with its political tensions and improvised hospitality, but by its potential. Here was a story of cooperation between native and European peoples. A story of shared food, prayer, and gratitude. A story that could be shaped into something America longed for: unity. In Hale's hands, the 1621 event transformed. It softened. It brightened. It became a symbol of peaceful beginnings rather than an example of fragile diplomacy. She wrote editorials, poems, and persuasive essays. She lobbied governors, clergymen, and presidents. She nudged the narrative gently but steadily until a single forgotten harvest meal began to glow with meaning. Her efforts did not catch on immediately. States celebrated their own versions of Thanksgiving on different days, often tied to harvest cycles or political events. There was no national holiday, no universal date, no shared vision. But Hale persisted, year after year, arguing that a single day of national gratitude would strengthen the fractured American spirit. And then the Civil War arrived. A country tearing itself apart suddenly needed symbols of unity more desperately than ever before. President Abraham Lincoln, looking for moments of national healing, responded to Hale's decades-long campaign. In 1863, in the midst of war, he declared a national day of Thanksgiving, not because of the Pilgrims, but because the nation needed a ritual of collective calm. Only after this declaration did the 1621 story begin its ascent into popular culture. It was retroactively adopted as the holiday's origin, polished and romanticized into a tale of peaceful harmony. Schoolbooks embraced it. Artists illustrated it. The story spread, simplified, reshaped, and repeated until it became inseparable from the holiday itself. But the truth remained. For 200 years, the first Thanksgiving meant nothing. It was a forgotten moment, buried under the weight of more immediate struggles, resurrected only when the nation needed a myth that suggested unity was possible, even if only for 3 days in 1621. And as Thanksgiving moved into the American imagination, another transformation began. The shift from a national symbol to a personal ritual, a quiet moment at home, a gathering of families, a story retold every year, whether or not the details were ever fully understood. That shift, from public narrative to private tradition, would become one of the most defining changes in the holiday's history. And in the next chapter, that evolution will start to take clearer shape. For all the warmth later attached to the story of 1621, the years that followed unfolded in a far more complicated rhythm, one built not on harmony, but on slow pressure, shifting power, and a widening gap between two peoples who had once shared a fragile, necessary peace. In the early decades after the Pilgrims' arrival, the Wampanoag still saw themselves as the stronger, older, and more rooted nation. The English were few. Their survival depended on Wampanoag knowledge and diplomacy. Massasoit maintained this balance carefully, enforcing agreements and keeping communication steady. For a time, the relationship remained workable, if not equal. But balance rarely lasts when one population grows, and the other is weakened by forces beyond its control. As more ships arrived from England, the tone of the land began to change. Forests thinned, fences appeared. Fields expanded into spaces the Wampanoag had once used seasonally, not as permanent property, but as part of a living cycle of hunting, farming, and gathering. The English notion of ownership clashed quietly but steadily with Wampanoag patterns of life. To the settlers, a deed meant possession. To the Wampanoag, a deed often meant shared use, shared stewardship, a temporary arrangement. Misunderstandings thickened, and the land grew more crowded with expectations. When Massasoit died in the 1660s, his leadership, which had always carried the weight of two worlds, passed to his son, Wamsutta, called Alexander by the English. He inherited not just authority, but the growing tension that surrounded it. His time as sachem was short, caught abruptly by illness after a fraught encounter with English officials. After Wamsutta's death, his brother Metacom, who the English called Philip, stepped into a world already cracking under pressure. Metacom watched the landscape shift in ways his father had predicted, but could not prevent. The English population multiplied, spreading outward from Plymouth and into lands the Wampanoag considered essential. Livestock wandered into Wampanoag cornfields. Settlers insisted on enforcing English laws on indigenous people, demanding fines, obedience, and submission in ways that echoed an unfamiliar and unwelcome hierarchy. Worse still, the English courts became a new source of imbalance. Disputes that had once been settled within Wampanoag circles were now decided by colonial judges who carried little understanding of indigenous law or custom. A wrong step, a disagreement over a boundary, a missed debt, all could end in punishment that felt foreign and humiliating. Yet even as resentment grew, Metacom did not begin with hostility. Like his father, he understood the cost of war. A Wampanoag population had been devastated by plague. Their numbers could not match the English. So he attempted negotiation, diplomacy, patience. But patience frayed quickly when the English demanded what he could not give: total submission to their legal authority and the surrender of indigenous weapons. The request was not just political, it was existential. A people without weapons was a people stripped of autonomy. The breaking point came in 1675, with the murder of John Sassaman, a Christianized native man who had warned the English that Metacom was preparing for conflict. He was later found dead in a frozen pond. The English accused 3 Wampanoag men of the crime, tried them in colonial court, and hanged them. To Metacom, this was not justice. It was the collapse of the last fragile strand holding peace together. War followed, not with a single declaration, but with scattered sparks that quickly turned into a wildfire. King Philip's War, as the English named it, was one of the deadliest conflicts in North American history relative to population size. Entire villages were burned. Crops were destroyed. Settlements vanished in flames. The violence was swift and merciless on both sides, fueled by fear, desperation, and long-growing anger. For the Wampanoag, the war was a fight for existence. They sought alliances with neighboring tribes, including the Narragansett, who had once stood as rivals. But alliances were complex. Old disputes resurfaced. Some tribes sided with the English, hoping to survive the colonial expansion by supporting the stronger force. The region's indigenous political landscape fractured under unbearable pressure. For the English colonies, the war reached their doorsteps with a level of fear they had never known. Towns were abandoned at night. Families fled to fortified shelters. Every crack in the underbrush became a warning. Every shadow held danger. To them, the Wampanoag were no longer neighbors or uneasy allies. They were enemies whose anger reflected decades of ignored grievances. The conflict consumed the region for more than a year, leaving devastation that neither side could ever fully recover from. As winter turned the soil hard, hunger spread among indigenous fighters. Ammunition ran low. English reinforcements arrived from neighboring colonies. The imbalance grew sharper. In 1676, as the war's momentum shifted, Metacom's resistance collapsed. He was hunted through the forests that had once sheltered his people. His death was brutal, and the treatment of his body was meant to send a message. The English were now the unchallenged power in the region. His allies were captured, killed, or sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Wampanoag autonomy, once the quiet foundation of their world, shattered. For the Wampanoag, the aftermath was not peace. It was loss layered upon loss. Their lands diminished, their political power dissolved, and their people scattered. The treaty relationships their ancestors had maintained became relics in the hands of a society that no longer needed indigenous cooperation to survive. What had started as a shared meal in 1621, however practical, however strained, now lay buried under the weight of a conflict that altered the entire region. And yet, in the centuries that followed, a strange transformation occurred. As Thanksgiving was reshaped into a national holiday of gratitude, the painful history of the Wampanoag became muted, softened, or forgotten altogether. The war that had defined their struggle was rarely mentioned. The complexities of their diplomacy were lost beneath the imagery of peaceful feasts and friendly meetings. The story that survived in public memory bore little resemblance to the world the Wampanoag had endured. Still, their history persisted, preserved in oral tradition, in community knowledge, and in the quiet insistence of descendants who refused to let the truth be erased. Modern Wampanoag communities continue to honor their ancestors, not through myth-making, but through memory, language revival, and the reclamation of identity. The tragedy of the Wampanoag is not that they disappeared, but that their reality was overwritten by a simpler tale the nation preferred to hear. And as the Thanksgiving myth grew brighter in the American imagination, a much darker story waited in its shadow, the story of resilience, loss, and survival that defined the Wampanoag people long after the Pilgrim's Feast faded into silence. And in the next chapter, the holiday itself begins to transform, shifting from a regional custom into a national ritual that carried its own political weight. By the early 19th century, Thanksgiving was still a scattered, uncertain thing, a patchwork of local customs, varying dates, and half-remembered traditions that meant something different in every region. In some states, it was a quiet church service. In others, a family dinner. In many places, it didn't exist at all. Nothing about it resembled a national holiday. No unified story tied it to the Pilgrims, to the Wampanoag, or to the 1621 gathering that would later be canonized. It was simply a leftover colonial habit that flickered here and there, depending on the imagination of a governor or the enthusiasm of a minister. But America in the 1800s was hungry for identity. The country was expanding, arguing, redefining itself every few decades. It needed a story, something old enough to feel rooted, but flexible enough to carry new meanings. And into this unsettled landscape stepped a woman whose influence would shape the holiday far more than any pilgrim or president. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hawley, and her determination was the quiet force that turned Thanksgiving into a national tradition. Hawley was not a politician, nor a public official. She had no government position, no formal authority. She was a writer, a poet, an editor, a woman who lived most of her life in black dresses after her husband died young, leaving her with 5 children to raise alone. But she possessed something more powerful than political office: a keen understanding of how stories shape nations, and a tireless belief that one good idea, repeated often enough, could create a tradition. For decades, she served as editor of Godey's Lady's Book, the most widely read magazine in America. It reached hundreds of thousands of homes, far more than newspapers or political pamphlets, and its influence stretched from Boston parlors to frontier cabins. Hawley used that platform with careful precision, weaving the idea of Thanksgiving into recipes, essays, serialized fiction, and editorials. She portrayed it not just as a meal, but as a ritual of moral strength, domestic harmony, and national unity. In a young country full of divisions, she framed Thanksgiving as a day that could soften regional tensions, gather families around quiet tables, and remind the nation of shared values. And she did not stop with storytelling. Hawley wrote letters, hundreds of them, to governors, senators, ministers, and eventually presidents. She wrote with patience, with unshakable politeness, and with relentless consistency. Each letter carried some version of the same message. A national day of Thanksgiving would strengthen the fractured American spirit. Even as states adopted the idea on their own, the holiday remained uneven, celebrated in November in one state, October in another, ignored entirely in the South. Hawley saw possibility in the inconsistency. A patchwork could be woven into a single cloth if someone simply kept stitching. What made Hawley remarkable was her ability to imagine a holiday before it truly existed. She described Thanksgiving dinners with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauces, pumpkin pies, dishes that were common enough in New England, but far from universal across the country. By writing about these foods as if they were already traditional, she helped them become traditional. Readers adopted the recipes. Families repeated the menus. Over time, the dishes hardened into expectation. Hawley was not trying to recreate 1621. In fact, she paid almost no attention to the Pilgrim's harvest meal. What she wanted was a ritual that felt old, but served a modern purpose. A day of gratitude that would promote unity in a country increasingly riven by political and regional conflicts. The Pilgrims were convenient symbols, but not central to her original argument. It was the emotional shape of the holiday, not its historical roots, that she believed mattered. Still, as the years passed, the story of the Pilgrims crept into Hale's retellings. Their struggle offered a kind of moral foundation: endurance, humility, divine providence, and the simplicity of a meal shared between colonists and indigenous people made for a clean, symbolic narrative, far cleaner than the messy reality of colonial expansion and indigenous suffering. Hawley did not invent the Pilgrim story, but she helped polish it into something Americans could hold on to, especially during moments of national anxiety. Her influence grew until it reached even the highest office. By the 1840s, many northern states had adopted Thanksgiving as an annual festival, usually in late November. But the South largely rejected it, seeing it as a New England custom with no relevance to their own history. The nation's disagreements hardened. tensions escalated. In the decade before the Civil War, Hale's letters became even more urgent. She argued that a shared holiday could soften divisions, offering Americans a moment of peace before conflict tore them apart. When war finally erupted, her campaign did not stop. If anything, it intensified. A country divided needed common symbols more than ever. And in 1863, in the shadow of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln read one of Hale's letters and agreed. He declared a national day of Thanksgiving to be observed on the last Thursday of November as a gesture of unity in a nation bleeding from within. Lincoln's proclamation transformed Hale's dream into reality, but her work had already laid the cultural groundwork. Americans recognized the holiday not because the president declared it, but because Hale had spent decades teaching them what it could mean. She lived long enough to see her vision take hold, but not long enough to see how deeply it would shape American identity. After her death in 1879, Thanksgiving continued to grow, spreading through schoolbooks, children's plays, and family traditions until it became almost inseparable from the national imagination. And as the decades passed, the story of 1621, once a forgotten paragraph in a colonial letter, fused with Hale's idealized vision to create the holiday as it is now understood. What makes her legacy unusual is not simply that she preserved a holiday, but that she invented its meaning. The Thanksgiving we know is part memory, part myth, part aspiration. It reflects her belief that nations need rituals that slow the world down, even for one day. Her letters stitched together a holiday that felt ancient, even though it was younger than she was. And as the next chapter unfolds, Thanksgiving begins to take a modern shape, shaped by presidents, wars, commerce, and the curious ways a nation continues to redefine what gratitude should look like. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached the White House in 1861, the country he was elected to lead had already begun falling apart. States were seceding, rail lines were being sabotaged, and the nation's map, once imagined as a solid shape, suddenly looked fragile, almost breakable. The years ahead would not bring peace. They would bring gunfire, empty towns, and letters written by candlelight to families who would never see their sons again. And in the middle of this national unraveling, a quiet idea, carried for decades by a persistent editor, finally found the moment it needed. Thanksgiving did not emerge from warmth. It emerged from grief. When Lincoln took office, he had no intention of creating a new national holiday. The war consumed every hour. The battles came quickly. Fort Sumter, Bull Run, Shiloh, each one a reminder that Americans were killing Americans, and that the nation's wounds ran deeper than anyone had dared to admit. Families did not gather for feasts. They waited for news. The postal system became a channel of both hope and devastation. And yet, in the middle of this darkness, Sarah Josepha Hogg continued her letters. She wrote to Lincoln not about troop movements or political divisions, but about the small rituals that might, in time, help bind a broken country together. A national day of gratitude, she argued, could remind people, North and South, that they still belonged to the same story. Lincoln read her letter in September of 1863, a moment when the war's weight felt heavier than ever. Just months earlier, the Battle of Gettysburg had left the fields of Pennsylvania filled with bodies. Townspeople had walked through the aftermath in stunned silence. Mothers recognized their sons only by the clothing they had sewn. Even the victorious felt hollowed by what they had seen. And yet something else lingered in that terrible summer, a fragile sense that the war had reached a turning point. Gettysburg, and then Vicksburg, had given the Union a rare thread of hope. Lincoln, always aware of timing, understood the need to mark that shift with a ritual that did not celebrate victory or violence, but steadiness and gratitude. He issued his proclamation on October 3, 1863. The words were not triumphant. They were measured, almost solemn. Lincoln spoke of the country's blessings, harvests that still grew despite the war, industries that still produced, families who still found resilience amid uncertainty. But he also acknowledged the sorrow that touched every corner of the nation. He asked Americans to gather not in celebration, but in humble penitence, recognizing both what had been lost and what might still be saved. He chose the last Thursday of November, a date that would eventually become the standard, not because of any historic event, but because the timing allowed soldiers and civilians alike a moment of pause before winter tightened its grip. What followed was not the instant creation of a joyful holiday. It was something quieter, the slow weaving of a shared ritual across a divided land. In the North, families observed the new Thanksgiving with a mixture of relief and grief. Tables were set, but prayers were spoken for sons still fighting or still missing. Letters were read aloud, some written by men who would never return. The meal became a moment to acknowledge endurance rather than abundance. In Union camps, soldiers improvised their own versions of the day. Some received special rations. Others shared whatever food they had saved, piecing together a meal from canned goods and hardtack. For a brief moment, even marching paused. Fires cracked in the cold, and men spoke quietly of home, imagining that their families were thinking of them at the same hour. The South, still at war and not bound by Lincoln's proclamation, did not observe the day in any formal way, but the idea floated there too, carried by newspapers and private letters. Even in Confederate territory, some ministers held services of gratitude, reflecting an older tradition of Thanksgiving days declared for military victories or good harvests. The idea of pausing for reflection was not foreign. Only the unity Lincoln had hoped for remained out of reach. But the proclamation had done something subtle. It framed Thanksgiving not as a regional custom, but as a national possibility, a ritual that might one day exist beyond conflict. Lincoln's choice carried emotional weight because of who he was. His life had been shaped by hardship, the loss of his mother in childhood, the death of his son, Willie, in the White House, the pressure of leading a country that seemed determined to tear itself apart. When Lincoln asked Americans to give thanks, it did not feel naive. It felt like a request made by someone who understood grief intimately and chose gratitude anyway. He issued 2 more Thanksgiving proclamations during the war, each one reiterating the theme of humility, unity, and national healing. They created a rhythm, a pattern, something that could become tradition if the country survived long enough to see peace. When the war ended in 1865 and Lincoln was assassinated just days later, his proclamation lingered with a kind of sacred resonance. Many Americans, mourning the president who had guided them through the nation's darkest hours, treated Thanksgiving as part of his legacy. It was something he had given them, not in triumph, but in sorrow, and that alone made the day feel deeper, older, almost consecrated. States began observing it more consistently. Newspapers published Lincoln's proclamation each year. Ministers quoted it in sermons. Families, still healing from the war, found comfort in a ritual that acknowledged both suffering and survival. Over the next decades, Thanksgiving slowly detached from the Civil War context and fused with the pilgrim narrative Halley had championed. The nation, hungry for simpler stories, leaned into the idea of peaceful beginnings rather than the reality of violent conflict. But Lincoln's original intention, the creation of a shared moment of reflection, remained quietly embedded in the holiday's foundation. Thanksgiving became official because of war. It took shape in the shadow of loss. It emerged from heartbreak, not abundance. And because of that, it carried a tone unlike any other American holiday, a mixture of gratitude and grief, of memory and hope. What followed next would continue to reshape it. Presidents adjusting dates, school books polishing myths, parades and commerce, weaving new traditions through old ones. But beneath the surface, Lincoln's proclamation remained the emotional spine of Thanksgiving, a reminder that even in the bleakest moments of history, people search for a reason to gather, to pause, and to remind themselves that a fractured nation can still share a single day. And in the next chapter, the holiday begins to settle into the 20th century, where parades, football, and presidential proclamations turn Lincoln's somber ritual into something far more familiar. By the time the 20th century rolled into view, Thanksgiving had already taken root in the national calendar, but the holiday itself was still finding its shape. Its meanings drifted between solemnity and celebration, between Lincoln's war-born humility and the more cheerful domestic rituals promoted by writers and magazines. And as the decades unfolded, new forces, industry, advertising, entertainment began adding layers to a holiday that had once been nothing more than a quiet proclamation during a time of grief. If Lincoln had given Thanksgiving its place on the calendar, ordinary Americans were the ones who slowly filled the day with familiar flavors. Turkey became the centerpiece not because it had been central to the 1621 meal. It wasn't, but because it was large, practical, and plentiful. A single bird could feed a table of many, something families valued as household sizes expanded and generations gathered under one roof. Newspapers printed roasting instructions. Cookbooks standardized stuffing, gravies, and the careful rhythm of basting. And as ovens grew more sophisticated and grocery stores more consistent, the turkey became less a choice and more an expectation, a symbol that the day had truly arrived. Side dishes followed their own quiet evolution. Cranberry sauce, once a homemade relish, became a national staple when canning factories began producing it in the early 1900s. Sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, green beans. Their presence on the table reflected regional traditions, immigrant influences, and the expanding availability of year-round produce. Pumpkin pie moved from farm kitchens to urban cookbooks, cementing its place as the holiday's final offering, a dessert that tasted like autumn, even when eaten in a city far from the fields where pumpkins once grew. Yet Thanksgiving's transformation didn't stop at the dining room table. As the holiday settled into American culture, cities and businesses began to see potential in the day, not just as a moment of gratitude, but as one of spectacle and gathering. In 1924, New York City witnessed the birth of what would become one of Thanksgiving's most iconic traditions, the Macy's Parade. Designed initially as a holiday advertising event, the parade blended commerce and celebration into a single floating procession. Live animals from the Central Park Zoo walked down the streets. Employees dressed as clowns, soldiers, and fairy tale characters marched alongside them. Crowds filled sidewalks, drawn less by tradition and more by curiosity. The balloons came later, enormous drifting creatures made of rubberized fabric, lifted by teams of handlers. These balloons transformed the parade into something dreamlike, a moving carnival of giants towering between buildings. Year after year, more people lined the streets. Newspapers covered the event. Radio broadcasts carried the music through living rooms. The parade became, without anyone meaning it to, a national signal that the holiday had truly begun. Football soon found its place in the holiday as well. The first Thanksgiving Day football game took place in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until the rise of professional leagues that the connection became permanent. Families across the country, already gathering together, began turning on radios and later televisions to listen or watch. The ritual stuck. For many, the day became a mixture of aromas from the kitchen and the steady commentary of broadcasters describing touchdowns and turnovers. The game wasn't just a distraction. It was another kind of gathering, one that bridged generations around a shared screen. While these traditions took root, presidents continued Lincoln's practice of issuing Thanksgiving proclamations. Over time, the language shifted from wartime humility to peacetime reflection. But one unusual tradition, almost whimsical on the surface, grew into something more iconic, the presidential turkey pardon. The origins of the ceremony are hazy, drifting between legend and public relations. Stories circulate about farmers gifting turkeys to presidents in the 19th century, about Lincoln sparing a bird at his son's request, about Truman jokingly accepting a turkey as if pardoning it. But the formal ceremony, the spectacle of a president smiling beside a plump, bewildered bird destined for freedom, solidified in the late 20th century. What began as a light-hearted gesture became a televised ritual, one that added a touch of gentle absurdity to a day otherwise marked by tradition and memory. Yet beneath these surface features, the meals, the parades, the games, the pardons, Thanksgiving's deeper transformation came from something subtler: the rise of commerce. As department stores expanded, as advertisements grew louder, and as the rhythm of American life shifted toward consumerism, Thanksgiving found itself increasingly tied to the machinery of holiday spending. The day after Thanksgiving, once nothing more than another Friday, slowly became a hinge between gratitude and commerce. Stores introduced early holiday sales. Window displays changed overnight. Crowds grew, and by the mid-20th century, Black Friday had emerged with a force that none of the Pilgrims, none of the Wampanoag, none of the 19th century advocates could have imagined. Thanksgiving's calm became the prelude to a rush. But even as commerce swept into the holiday, reshaping its edges, the core of the day remained remarkably stable. Families continued to travel across states, down highways, through airports, carrying casseroles wrapped in foil and pies balanced on knees. Kitchens filled again with the same aromas that had lingered over them for generations. Conversations echoed between rooms. Old disputes softened for the sake of the day. The modern traditions layered themselves atop older ones, but the underlying desire to gather, to pause, to give thanks stayed intact. Still, the holiday's meaning shifted with each generation. For some, Thanksgiving became a comforting ritual. For others, a complicated one, shaped by the truths of indigenous history and the myths preserved in schoolbooks. Parades and football offered escape, while the meal itself became a symbol of stability in a world that moved faster each year. The holiday grew, changed, adapted, and occasionally contradicted itself. A blend of memory, myth, and modernity. By the end of the 20th century, Thanksgiving had become one of the few moments when nearly the entire country paused at the same time. Highways filled, ovens warmed, screens glowed with parades and games. Presidents stood beside pardoned turkeys, and somewhere beneath it all was the faint echo of earlier versions of the day: Lincoln's somber prayer, Hale's imagined table, the forgotten harvest of 1621, and the deeper, older traditions of gratitude that long predated the holiday's name. The next chapter explores the growing movement to re-examine Thanksgiving, the calls to reckon with its history, the indigenous perspectives that challenge old narratives, and the modern efforts to reimagine what gratitude means in a world still carrying the weight of its past. If you look at Thanksgiving across 4 centuries, the holiday resembles a long shoreline, the waves of history washing over it again and again, reshaping its edges while leaving the same quiet stretch of sand beneath. What began as a moment of endurance in the 17th century, later revived as a national balm during a civil war, and then woven into modern life through parades and televised games, now stands as something softer, more inward. A day that carries myth, memory, contradiction, and comfort all at once. For most people today, Thanksgiving is not about the pilgrims or proclamations or parades. It is not about the long-ago tension between two communities, nor the editorial campaigns that stitched the holiday together. It is not even about turkey, though the bird has certainly become its unofficial mascot. The heart of the holiday is quieter, a table set for familiar faces, a momentary slowing of time, a ritual of shared presence in a world that rarely pauses at all. Modern life rushes. Days slide into each other. Notifications blink. Work spills into evenings. The world feels noisy, even when nothing is happening. But on Thanksgiving, No matter how imperfect or improvised the gathering, there is a subtle shift. People stop. They sit. They pass dishes back and forth. They talk, sometimes in circles, sometimes in fragments, sometimes about nothing. The meaning isn't in the food, but in the nearness of others, even when the table is small or the room is quiet. And that, perhaps, is what has allowed Thanksgiving to endure, even as its history is re-examined and its mythology reconsidered. Beneath centuries of changing stories lies an instinct older than any holiday. The desire to gather, to acknowledge a year lived, to find grounding in the company of others. Yet the modern Thanksgiving carries another layer, a growing awareness of the stories once smoothed over by tradition. Many families begin their meals with land acknowledgments, recognizing the indigenous nations whose histories predate every modern ritual. Schools now teach versions of the holiday that stretch beyond the tidy myths that filled textbooks in the past. People talk openly about the complexities of the 1621 gathering, the tragedy that followed, and the importance of remembering more than the polished version of the story. This shift doesn't erase the holiday. Instead, it deepens it. Gratitude becomes not just celebration, but reflection and awareness of what was lost, what was preserved, and what still needs healing. The holiday's meaning expands, making room for truth alongside tradition. As the day continues to evolve, families create their own customs, weaving together old habits and new understandings. Some tables are loud with conversation, laughter spilling across the room. Others are quiet, marked by empty chairs that hold the weight of absence. Some meals happen in small apartments, under soft lamplight. Others unfold outdoors, under wide autumn skies. There is no single way the day must look. The holiday breathes with the shape of each family, each gathering, each person who pauses long enough to feel the shift. Commerce buzzes around it, sales, travel rushes, advertisements. But inside homes, behind closed doors, the ritual is more intimate. Someone checks a pie in the oven. Someone peels potatoes at a counter. Someone sets out plates, adjusting them a little to make the table feel right. Children wander in and out of rooms. Elders settle into chairs. The scent of cooking drifts through hallways and lingers in the air long after the meal ends. These small details, repeated year after year, become personal history. They anchor people even when the wider world feels unsteady. And still, gratitude itself has changed. For many, it is no longer only about abundance. It is about endurance, the fact that people have made it through difficult seasons, uncertain months, long stretches of silence or struggle. It is about the relief of being together, despite distance, illness, stress, or loss. It is about noticing what remains, even when the year has taken things away. Some find gratitude in simple things: warmth, food, shelter, a moment of calm. Others find it in relationships that have weathered time. Some find it in solitude, discovering that stillness can also be a kind of gathering, a meeting with oneself that the rest of the year rarely allows. The holiday has become a reflection rather than a reenactment. Its mythic origins give way to personal meaning. Each family interprets it differently. Some rituals fade, others rise. And yet, the day persists, reshaped by each generation, but grounded in the same impulse to pause. If you trace its evolution, Thanksgiving looks less like a story with a beginning and more like a long braid, strands of survival, myth-making, war, industry, family, and quiet reflection, woven into something that continues to change without ever breaking completely. It carries the imprint of every era it passed through, but it no longer belongs to any single one of them. It belongs to the present moment each year, recreated fresh around every table. And perhaps that is why Thanksgiving endures when so many other traditions fade. It does not demand perfection, or ceremony, or historical purity. It asks only for presence, whatever form that presence takes. A gathering of many, a meal shared by two, a phone call across states, a quiet evening spent remembering those who are no longer there. It allows for joy, for sorrow, for contradiction, for gratitude that comes softly rather than triumphantly. In the end, gratitude is not about overlooking the past. It is about acknowledging the complexity of the present, the threads of pain and hope, the quiet victories, the long endurance that carries people forward. Thanksgiving, at its best, is simply a place to set that awareness down for a moment and breathe. As night settles on the holiday, dishes are stacked, rooms grow dim, and conversations taper into calm. The day ends the way it once began, with people gathering around a moment, trying to make sense of the year behind them, holding on to whatever light they can find. And just as it has for centuries, the holiday slips gently into the next morning, waiting to be reshaped again the following year. A reminder that even in a noisy world, there is still something powerful in the simple act of pausing, sharing, remembering, and giving thanks.